There's a specific kind of horror that doesn't come from a stranger. I think that's what makes this story harder to tell than some of the others I could tell you. This one didn't start in a dark parking lot or on a rural road at night. It started at a desk 12 feet from mine, from a man I said good morning to 5 days a week for almost a year before I understood what he actually was. I worked in a mid-size office, the kind of place with cubicles and a shared kitchen and a rotating cast of people who came and went every year or two. His name doesn't matter for this story, so I'll just call him by the desk he sat at, which is honestly closer to how I think of him now anyway. He started about 8 months after I did, mid-30s, quiet, competent at his job, the kind of coworker who remembers your coffee order and asks about your weekend in a way that seems considerate rather than intrusive. For most of a year, I would have told you he was one of the more pleasant people in that office. I want you to hold on to that, because it's going to matter later. The most unsettling people I've ever encountered were never unsettling at first. That's not an accident. It's the whole design. He wasn't the kind of coworker anyone would have flagged as odd either, which I think is important to say plainly. He came to happy hours when they were organized. He brought donuts on Fridays sometimes, the ordinary generous gestures that make a person well-liked in an office setting. If you'd asked anyone else on that floor what they thought of him in those first several months, you'd have heard some version of nice guy, keeps to himself mostly, good at his job. Nobody would have used the word dangerous. I wouldn't have either, not then, and that's exactly what makes this kind of thing so difficult to catch early. Danger doesn't usually announce itself by being unpleasant. It announces itself, if it announces itself at all, in details that are too specific to be coincidence and too small to justify the alarm they quietly set off in you. The first moment that should have told me something was wrong happened on an ordinary Tuesday, months into working alongside him, during a conversation so mundane I almost didn't remember it afterward, until I had a reason to go back and pick it apart. We were talking about weekend plans, the kind of small talk that fills the last 20 minutes before people start packing up on a Friday. And I mentioned in passing that I needed to finally deal with the crack in my driveway before winter made it worse. He nodded and said, without missing a beat, "Yeah, that side by your garage is getting pretty bad. Not the crack in general, the specific side, by the garage." I hadn't told him which side. I hadn't told him anything about my driveway at all beyond the single sentence I'd just said, which mentioned no location, no detail, nothing that would let anyone picture the actual layout of my property. I remember laughing it off in the moment, some reflexive social laugh that covers confusion before your brain has caught up to it, and asking him how he knew that. He shrugged, said something vague about probably having driven past my house once dropping off a mutual friend, though when I thought about it later, I couldn't place any mutual friend who'd have a reason to be near my house, let alone one who'd have driven him there specifically. I let it go. I want to be honest about how easy it is to let things like that go, especially with someone you see every day, someone who's never given you a reason to think of them as dangerous. The alternative, treating a friendly coworker as a threat over one strange comment, felt so much more socially costly in the moment than simply accepting the vague explanation and moving on. That's the mechanism this whole story runs on, I think. Not any one moment being enough to justify fear. Just enough ordinary plausibility stacked on top of each strange detail to make you doubt your own read of the situation every single time. The second moment came about 6 weeks later. We were in the break room, and I was telling another coworker about a leak I'd finally gotten fixed under my kitchen sink. And he said, from across the room, not even part of the conversation until that point, Did they end up replacing the whole disposal or just the trap? I hadn't mentioned a disposal. I'd said sink. I'd said leak. I had not described to anyone in that office what specific fixture under my kitchen sink had needed attention. I looked at him for a moment longer than felt natural, and he looked back at me with an expression I've never been able to fully describe since, something between mild confusion at my reaction and something else underneath it, something that watched my confusion land and seemed almost satisfied by it. He said, "Sorry, I just assumed, since you mentioned a leak, disposals go bad a lot," which is true technically. Disposals do go bad a lot, and it's not an unreasonable guess for someone to make, but it was too specific a guess, landed too precisely for me to fully believe it was one.
I started paying closer attention after that. Not obsessively, not at first, just a low hum of awareness running under every conversation we had, tracking the small things he said that he had no clear way of knowing. Over the next 2 months, there were at least 4 more moments like that. He mentioned once that my back fence had finally gotten fixed, a fence I had, in fact, had repaired in a specific corner of my backyard that isn't visible from the street, isn't visible from any neighboring property, and had never once come up in any conversation at work. He referenced another time a specific paint color I'd chosen for a bedroom, a room I had never discussed with anyone at that office, in a comment so casual it almost slid past me entirely before the wrongness of it caught up. There was one more, a few weeks after the paint comment, that unsettled me more than any of the others because of how ordinary it sounded out loud, even as it landed like ice water in my chest. We were walking out to the parking lot at the end of the day, and he mentioned conversationally that he hoped the new street light on my block would cut down on all that shadow by the mailbox. I don't live on a street with a new street light. I do live on a street that had, in fact, just had one installed 2 weeks earlier at the corner nearest my mailbox, a detail so hyper-local, so specific to my particular block, that there was no plausible way for someone who'd simply driven by once to know it, let alone to know it well enough to comment on how it would affect a shadow I hadn't personally noticed until he said it. I started keeping a private list on my phone, dates and quotes every time it happened, because somewhere in the accumulation of these small moments, I'd stopped being able to convince myself it was coincidence and started needing evidence I could actually point to, both for my own sanity and for whoever I'd eventually have to explain this to. Reading back through that list now, laid out end to end instead of scattered across months of ordinary conversation, it reads less like a series of odd comments and more like a slow, deliberate accounting of a property he'd apparently spent a great deal of time getting to know without my permission or my knowledge. I checked my own social media accounts obsessively during this stretch, certain there had to be some leak, some old post I'd forgotten about that showed my backyard or my kitchen or the color of a bedroom wall. I found nothing. My accounts were private, had been for years, and even scrolling back through everything I'd ever posted, I couldn't find a single photo or caption that would explain any of the specific details he'd casually dropped into conversation, which left me with a question I didn't want to sit with for very long. If he wasn't finding this information online, the only place left for him to be finding it was in person. I want to tell you I confronted him directly and got some dramatic confession, but that's not what happened. What happened is smaller and stranger, and I think somehow worse. I asked him casually over lunch one day how he even knew where I lived, framing it as an offhand curiosity rather than the accusation it actually was. He said he didn't, not really, that he just had a good memory for things people mention, which directly contradicted the fact that I had never mentioned any of the specific things he'd referenced. When I pointed that out, gently, testing to see how he'd respond, he got quiet for a moment and then said something that has stayed lodged in my chest ever since. He said, "I guess I just pay attention to people I like." I didn't know what to do with that sentence for a long time. It wasn't a denial, it wasn't a confession either. It sat in this strange middle space that let him seem, to anyone overhearing it, like he was being sweetly, harmlessly earnest, while landing on me like a hand closing slowly on something. The moment that finally pushed me from unsettled to actively afraid happened about 3 weeks after that lunch conversation. I came home from work and found my porch light bulb had been replaced. Not broken and left broken, the way it would be if it had simply burned out on its own. Replaced with a bulb of a slightly different brand than the ones I normally buy, screwed in cleanly, functioning perfectly, in a fixture I hadn't touched in months and definitely hadn't asked anyone to service. I installed a doorbell camera within the week, along with 2 additional cameras covering the side and back of the house, the same corners he'd referenced in those earlier conversations, the fence, the driveway, the spots that shouldn't have been visible or known to anyone who hadn't actually been standing there. For the first 2 weeks, the cameras caught nothing except my own comings and goings, delivery drivers, a neighbor's cat that likes to cut through my yard, the ordinary texture of a quiet residential street.
Then, on a Wednesday night, a little after 11, the camera covering my back fence caught a figure standing at the corner of my yard, motionless for almost 6 minutes, before turning and walking away into the dark beyond the reach of the camera's light. The footage wasn't clear enough to identify a face with total certainty, but the build, the way he stood, the specific stillness of it matched something I'd started noticing about him at work without ever quite naming it, a way of holding himself in a room that made him easy to overlook, right up until you needed to actually look for him. I brought the footage to HR the next morning, along with the list I'd been keeping on my phone. Every strange comment, every date, every impossible detail he'd known. HR took it seriously in the careful, procedural way large companies take things seriously when they're worried about liability, which is to say, seriously enough to launch an internal investigation, not seriously enough to immediately confirm anything I already believed to be true. He was placed on administrative leave within the week while they reviewed building access logs, which showed, according to what I was eventually told in a brief guarded meeting, that his badge had been used to exit the building on several evenings well after his shift had officially ended, times that lined up, loosely but consistently, with the strange details he'd later brought up in conversation. He never came back to that office. I don't know the full resolution of whatever happened internally, because companies rarely tell you the whole story once legal involvement enters the picture, only that his employment ended, quietly, without the kind of clear explanation that would have let me feel like the matter had actually closed. I filed a police report separately, using the camera footage and my documented list, and was told, gently, that without a clearer image or a direct threat on record, there wasn't much more law enforcement could act on beyond a formal warning attached to his name should anything happen again. I moved within 4 months of that camera footage. I told people at the new place, casually, the kind of half-true cover story you learn to give when the real one takes too long and asks too much of a stranger, that I just wanted a change of scenery. I never fully explained why the change had felt less like a preference and more like a necessity.
I still think about that porch light sometimes, more than almost anything else in this whole story. Not the fence, not the paint color, not even the 6 motionless minutes on a night vision camera. The light bulb. Because everything else could be explained away, eventually, as observation, as someone paying closer attention than a coworker reasonably should. but a replaced bulb means a hand reaching up into a fixture on my own porch, taking the time to fix something small and unnecessary, leaving it working exactly the way it should, as if to say, without ever needing to say it out loud, that he had been close enough, long enough, to take care of something of mine. I've talked to a couple of former coworkers since all of this happened, carefully, the way you bring up something you're still not sure how to categorize even after it's over. One of them told me she'd always found him a little too easy to talk to, in a way she could never quite articulate as a red flag at the time. Just a vague sense that he remembered things about people a little more precisely than the conversation would have naturally supplied. Another told me she'd once mentioned, offhand, a health scare involving a family member, and he'd followed up on it weeks later with a level of specific concern that had felt, in her words, like he'd been thinking about it a lot more than a coworker should. Neither of them had connected those moments to anything sinister before I brought it up. Both of them, once I laid it out, went quiet in the same way I imagine I must have looked the day the disposal comment first landed. If a coworker ever knows something about your home that you're certain you never told them, don't explain it away the way I did, again and again, for months, because each individual moment felt too small on its own to justify the fear underneath it. The fear underneath it is usually right. It's the explanations that are usually wrong.